This is a demonstration of making a mold from your clay bust sculpture. We are making a two-part mold. So the mold will be half cutting in half here, and the molds will come apart like this. We are doing it across here, that way we don't get a line of our mold around the middle of the face. So instead of having a line around the middle of the face, we have a line around the side, so it's a little bit easier to clean up. Now, our mold, we want our parting line to follow the highest part of our sculpture. So this line is pretty much the highest part. See how the highest part for these two parts to come apart comes up here, and then it follows the top of the ear, right? That's the highest point from this side and this side. So we follow it up on this side, and then on this side of the sculpture, our line comes around here. Again, across the top of the ear, the highest part of the ear, and then down the side. So the highest part between this side and this side. Next, I take some of my leftover clay, and I want to make a parting line to go around that line that I just drew. I roll out my clay till I get a cylinder. Then I take this cylinder, I flatten it out. I take my knife and I cut it. So that my wall is about this thick, and it's a little over an inch, maybe an inch and a quarter thick or wide, and about this thick. And then I start to place my wall around that parting line. And I've decided I'm going to cast the front first. So if I'm casting the front first, I'm putting this wall on the back side of this line here. I will take some more of my clay, stretch it out, cut it so that it is about an inch and a quarter. And then I continue this wall so it goes around the side here. And then at the bottom of the sculpture, I'm putting a little bit of clay around. That is my pouring cup. You can see this clay that I'm putting around the bottom here. So it's not quite as thick as the bottom of my sculpture. So this is going to be where I pour in the plaster after I finish the mold. If you're doing shoulders, if it comes all the way down to the base, you don't have to worry about this. This is only if it's cut off before the bottom of your base. So I'm making my pouring cup to go all the way around the bottom here, about the same thickness. and a thickness that's big enough that I can pour into. I will take my clay and I will finish this parting line. This wall around the side of my, following my parting line. So I'll come around on this side here. And I end my wall at the bottom of my pouring cup. So that's where it ends there. Okay, so there's my wall. It goes around my sculpture. You want to make sure that the wall is firmly attached to your sculpture. Don't press it in too much, because when you take it off, you'll lose some detail. But notice how my wall comes straight down. So it meets, here's my sculpture, here's where the wall hits. Here. Don't smooth it out like this, because we want to keep this wall like very sharp, perpendicular to keep our detail. The back doesn't matter because we're not casting this at this time. Now you can add some balls in the back here. Don't press these on too hard so that you lose your detail, but this helps to support our wall. So these are just supports for our wall. And we want to make sure that we go all around the whole sculpture here. Okay. Now I am going to pour plaster so it covers this whole front half of the sculpture, and it will be about this thick. So the whole mold will be about 1 inch thick and cover the whole sculpture on the front here. In order to do that, I am going to make it easier. I'm going to turn my sculpture on its side here, put a little support here. I'm going to mix plaster and then I'm going to pour it on. Next, you have to decide how much plaster you're going to use. So if I'm going to cover this whole side here, I think I might need about a little bit more than what would fill up this yogurt container. This is a 32-ounce yogurt container. Now, pretty much if you fill this up halfway with water, it will take about this much of plaster. So I am going to use a little bit more than halfway. So I'm using about this much water. That's what I think I will need for this. So I take my water and I put it into my bucket with the paint liner in the bucket. Then this is slip that I mixed up. Slip is just take some of your clay and take some very hot water and mix it in, and it will dissolve the clay. So it looks almost like a milkshake consistency. Okay, and I'm going to pour a little bit into my water. Now, the reason I'm putting this into the water is to color my plaster so that my plaster is a brown color. So my mold will be a brown color. When I pour in plaster, after this hardens and we do both sides and we pull it apart, we put it back together and we pour plaster into the inside, and we pour in just plain white plaster. And that way we can tell the difference from the mold, which will be a little brown color, from the plaster that will be the sculpture itself. So I pour this into here. Then I take my plaster and I sprinkle it on the top, over the top of my water. Taking my plaster and I'm sprinkling it on top of the water. Just like we did when we did our organic form project. So I'm sprinkling it all over the top of that water until it starts to just saturate the water and starts to sit on the surface of the water. And then that will give me the consistency that I'm looking for my mold. So I sift this over the top so the plaster begins to just sit on the surface. So it starts to sit on the surface of the water. Take my hand and I mix up that plaster. So the plaster, you want it to become that kind of pancake batter kind of consistency. So you, getting all the lumps out of it, so it kind of gets this consistency to it. Then I take my plaster, bring it up close to my sculpture, and I drip it on my mold, or on my sculpture. You want to do this before this plaster starts to harden so that you catch all the detail in your sculpture. You don't want to put too much on because then it will just drip off of your sculpture and make a mess. But you want to drip it on to the whole sculpture. Make sure that you get it on the whole sculpture. And then you can touch it with your finger, and you can also blow on it. Close your eyes so in case you get plaster. Especially any undercuts like around the eyes and details. You can blow into it to make sure that there aren't any air pockets, or touch it with your finger. Okay, and then you're going to have to wait for this to get to that hard consistency where it won't fall off of the sculpture. Then we want to try to keep it so we get an inch thick around the whole sculpture, from the side up around to the top and around to the other side, and around from here around from here And so it goes all the way around. Here we want to have that an inch thick. So just try to visualize that. And then you wait till your plaster gets thicker. Okay, now I think I have enough plaster on my mold. Like I say, support this wall with stilts, with paper cups, with anything. Because I just had a few disasters where my wall collapsed. So here I put my plaster on. I scrape my plaster off of my fingers and I apply it on. So we want to make sure that we have the whole thing covered with at least 1/2 inch to 1 inch thick. Okay, I have some plaster left over. Instead of letting it all harden at the bottom of my container, I'm putting it into a ball. And I'm going to let that harden so it's easier to break out of the container. Then you should always have a bucket of water so you can wash off your hands. Remember, do not wash your hands in the sink. And don't put clay or plaster down your sink. As my plaster hardens before it gets hard, I go around the whole edge of that parting line and that wall, and I scrape off plaster so that I can see that wall that goes all around my sculpture, and see how I'm scraping it down so the plaster goes straight up from that wall. Okay, then after your plaster gets pretty hard, we can take off our supports, and we have our first half of our sculpture done. When your plaster gets hard enough, you can remove this wall. Wait for your plaster to get hard enough. Kind of doing it too soon here. Then you want to remove this whole wall around your whole sculpture. My plaster has dried. I've taken off that back wall. As you can see, it's quite messy because I made that mistake and my wall collapsed in. Hopefully yours won't be as rough as this. Okay, and you can see the thickness of the mold. This is a little thick, doesn't need to be quite this thick. I would say 1/2 inch to 1 inch is enough. Then I took some of my scrap clay, putting my sculpture down so it is horizontal again. I've cleaned out my bucket and my liner. This time, since I used too much plaster, I'm only filling this up halfway. This time I'm using warm water so that it will harden quicker. Then I'm going to mix up plaster and I'm going to put it on the side. Before I do that, I'm taking some of my slip. And I'm taking my slip and I am painting it on that parting line. Doesn't matter if I get a little on my sculpture because it's just clay. But I try not to get, you don't want to lose your detail either. This is a release agent. So when our two parts of our mold, when we take them apart, they will be able to separate. So make sure that you don't forget this step. Make sure that it covers that whole parting line that goes around the edge here. So that whole edge is covered with that clay slip. Then I take some of my plaster or some of my slip, and I pour it into my water. That's just the coloring agent that I'm using in my water. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to mix up this plaster, then I'm going to put it on this side. So I sifted my plaster so it sits on the top, and it will look like this when it starts to sit on the top. Then I will take my hand and I will mix it up, kind of squeezing it to get out all the lumps. And then again, before it gets thick, when it's still in this early stage, I will put that first layer on my sculpture to catch all the details. So I will take my plaster and I will drip it on my sculpture. Making sure that it doesn't drip off of that wall. And then again, as soon as I cover my sculpture, I'll touch it for any details. Touch on it for any details. And then I just wait till the plaster gets harder before putting the rest on. The rest I want to cover right up to that parting line, and again, make it the same thickness all the way around. So now I am putting on that last layer, covering this half and making it so it has about 1/2 inch to an inch thickness all around the whole sculpture. Now, watch how I scrape away all around that parting line. And wait for it to get a little bit harder, and then I'll show you the next step. Now, before my plaster gets too hard, I'm going around this whole side here, around the whole parting line. And I need to be able to see a clear line. That's the line of our slip that we put on. We need to see a clear line around the whole sculpture. So keep following that line around. Make sure that you know where it is. And it's a continuous line. if there's any breaks in your line, we won't be able to get it apart. So before it gets hard, otherwise it's a pain to try to chip away that line after it gets hard. So I'm going around that whole side of my sculpture. So you can see there is a line, a clear line that goes around the whole sculpture. You can see it at the top and how it goes around to this side. And then the bottom. So the bottom, that's our pouring cup right here. So then after it hardens, my sculpture is still not totally hard, but I can take off my armature. And this is that pouring cup. So I would just want to make sure that that pouring cup is clear. So then when I take my sculpture apart, I make sure that line goes all the way across your parting line and your pouring cup, so that these two pieces will come apart. Okay, and that's it for our mold making. Next demonstration I will do taking our molds apart and taking the clay out and then turning it upside down, and we pour our plaster in here.